thank you, Shireen, for inviting me to talk, and welcome to everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here this morning to talk to you about vegan nutrition, particularly in relation to sustainable diets. There's so much more information out there now, and I think it's wonderful to see so many stores, so many people. It's really exciting. And I'd like to dedicate my talk to Arthur Ling, who was a pioneer of the first vegan soy milk in the UK. And I don't know if anybody here remembers Arthur or knew Arthur. Okay, well, in the photograph here, Arthur Ling is in the middle of the photo. And as I said, in 1965, the first soy milk was introduced to the UK. Arthur became vegan when he was 7 years old. So as you can imagine, all those years ago, it was almost impossible to be vegan. And when he was in his 30s, there was no plant milk at all, so he campaigned to try and get a plant milk introduced to the UK, and no companies were interested at all. So with a group of friends, they started researching it and tried making their own milk. And they came up with green milks, brown milks, all these different coloured milks, till eventually they got a soya isolate from abroad, and they then developed the first ever soy milk in the UK. It initially came out in tins, which I think now would be wonderful if it was available in tins. Then with the development of Tetra Paks, they brought it out in a Tetra Pak. But it was a small Tetra Pak in concentrated format. So he thought to save on packaging, to save people having to carry lots of water home with them, you bought your concentrated soy milk and you went home and diluted it. He was way ahead of his time. Wouldn't it be wonderful if he was here today to see this growth in veganism? So for those who don't know me, as Shireen said, I'm a dietitian. I work for the NHS. My speciality is diabetes, and there's a growing amount of people developing diabetes, sadly, these days. So I'm going to touch about it in my talk. But I became vegan in the 1970s, and then it was a matter of eating very simple, unprocessed foods. I used to make my own vegan cheese with soya flour, yeast extract, and the only margarine available was Tomor. And there may be some of you who remember Tomor margarine. Whereas now there's so many convenience vegan foods. So what I'm going to cover is, as Shireen said, the One Blue Dot document, which is fantastic that dietitians are now embracing the importance of sustainable eating and the effect it has on our environment. So I'm going to cover that with you. I'm then going to talk about the nutritional considerations for a vegan diet, and then look and see how that relates to sustainable eating. Then I'm going to very briefly touch on carbohydrates with regard to type 2 diabetes, and then summarize everything. And if there's time, try and answer any questions you have. So the first thing I want to talk about is the One Blue Dot document. The One Blue Dot document came about after about 4 years ago. I was asked to develop a plant-based eating group as part of the British Dietetic Association because there was growing interest in vegan and vegetarian diets. So as part of the public health interest group of the British Dietetic Association, we had the plant-based group. And then from that, it was decided we were best placed to update the position paper on sustainable diets. It was almost like opening a can of worms. There was so much in that to cover, and I was privileged to work with a wonderful group of very forward-thinking dietitians. And we decided we needed something like a toolkit to try and explain it in more detail. So this is where One Blue Dot came about. In 2016, Public Health England updated their Eat Well guide, and they introduced sustainability as part of that, which is wonderful. And then, as I said, in November last year, One Blue Dot, a practical guide, was developed, and it was to give to dietitians to try and inform them how to introduce sustainable eating into everyday healthy eating guidelines. So One Blue Dot, the name comes from when Voyager left Earth and looked down and saw this one blue dot, and that one blue dot was Earth. So we decided to call the document One Blue Dot. and it is our home. It's the only one we have, and it is our responsibility to take care. And because food production contributes up to 30% of total greenhouse gas emissions in the UK, it's a significant contribution to global warming. So our current food systems is a leading cause of deforestation, biodiversity loss, and water pollution. At the end of last year, the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change made strong recommendations about dietary change. And so the British Dietetic Association have started to lead the way on how this can be achieved. We've got a growing demand for food, and we've got a growing population. And it's great news that dietitians are on board with this. So overfishing and poor fishing practices have impacted on wild fish populations. Now, interestingly here, I initially put on wild fish stocks, and a friend of mine said, why call it stocks? They're not our stocks, they're not for us to eat, they're populations. So again, we sort of dehumanize all these different sayings, and it almost makes it acceptable for us to do these things. So my typing error, stocks has stayed in that, but it's reminded me they're populations of species that we should respect. And what's very interesting is the amount of food we waste as well that's spoiled. So the highlights that the document brought about was about red and processed meat. We know that has the biggest impact on the environment. And with the Public Health England, they've now put emphasis on prioritising plant proteins over animal proteins. So Public Health England now in their written documents give plant proteins priority, which is wonderful news. Also, the World Health Organization has put emphasis on more plant-based diets, which they've done for years and years. But at last, we are waking up to that. So emphasis with this document is on reducing red and processed meats, because we know livestock farming accounts for 10% of the UK total greenhouse gas emissions. And as you all know, the World Cancer Research Fund has recommended that processed meat should be avoided. So we know reducing your red and processed meats is associated with reduced risk of cancers and saturated fat, reducing that, increasing fibre, all helps with long-term chronic conditions. So changing to a plant-based diet is a win-win for animals, for people, and for our environment. So I just thought I'd show you this to emphasise how much greenhouse gas emissions come from animal products. So you can see vegans have a much smaller footprint. So again, this is highlighted to dietitians in the document to encourage them to think about the link, not only with the health risks of having too much animal products, but also the impact on the environment. So the kinds of emphasis is shifting away, as I said, from animal proteins and going more to our beans and pulses, nuts and seeds. Interestingly, the British Dietetic Association recognises that a vegan diet more closely meets the Department of Health recommendations and also is the best for health and for the environment. But research shows that if you talk to people about changing to a vegan diet, it puts them off. So the BDA have decided to talk about plant-based eating, reducing your animal products, having more plant products, than saying change to a vegan diet. The group of people I work with on this working party are wonderful forward-thinking dietitians, and the majority of them are vegan. But again, they appreciate that saying veganism puts people off. I don't know if people have seen this vegan plate that's been developed by two dietitians, which is a lovely clear picture of the mix of foods we should be eating as vegans. We now know that we can easily meet all the recommendations on a vegan diet, but there are still some concerns about where we get these nutrients from. But I want to reassure everybody, which I'm sure you're all sure of here, that we do not need to eat animals for any essential nutrients at all. All the essential nutrients come from plants. Fruits and vegetables make up the majority of what we eat, and as adults, We should include some starchy carbohydrates and obviously protein-based foods, but they should all be the accompaniment to our fruits and vegetables. So with fruits and vegetables, for a sustainability point of view, there's a lot of things we can do as vegans to try and help the planet. There is no doubt that vegans more closely meet public health messages and the Department of Health recommendations. So we all know a minimum of 5 portions of fruits and vegetables a day is recommended. Interestingly, when I was reading a paper a couple of years ago, the English Health Survey showed that the general population are under-consuming fresh fruits and vegetables, which we are all aware of. But the figures I was quite surprised with. Only 29% of adults eat the recommended 5 portions per day. And research shows we should be eating more than that. But again, if people are told to eat more, they struggle. So the 5 portions is what's recommended. But as I said, only 29% of adults are meeting that requirement. And only 18% of our children are eating aged 5 to 15 are eating the 5 standard portions. It's thought the shift away from eating fresh fruits and vegetables could be to do with people moving away from our regular 3 meals a day kind of eating pattern. People mostly grazing, grabbing food on the foot and not being aware of what they're eating. How vegans fit into this pattern isn't clear, but I'm aware with all this processed vegan food available, it's very easy for vegans to slip into an unhealthy way of eating. So while plant proteins are more environmentally sustainable, assessing the environmental impact is quite difficult and more complex. And the impact will vary significantly depending on how and where they are produced. So for example, consuming fruits and vegetables out of season, which are produced in greenhouses, require more heating, refrigeration, or air freight. And then there's the perishability concerns. Perishable fruits and vegetables make up the majority of household waste, which is a major contribution to greenhouse gas emissions. So recommendations are to choose more tinned or frozen fruits and vegetables. Choose seasonally, local produced vegetables and avoid the perishable ones. Also things like ready cut fruits and vegetables. Try to go for loose as much as possible. Beans and pulses do have very low greenhouse gas emissions and they do count as a vegetable. So try to choose your fruits and vegetables wisely. As I said, the air freighted, the more perishable fruits and vegetables are going to have a bigger impact on the environment. So try to go for more of the hard fruits and vegetables, which generates relatively low impacts compared to salad vegetables. And also look for more fair trade. It's interesting with dried fruit, the majority of it is sun-dried, particularly if you get something like apricots that come from Pakistan. And because it's dried, it's lighter to transport, and the fuel costs are going to be a lot less because they can be moved by sea in unrefrigerated ships. So then it's got a lower greenhouse gas emission. So dried fruits and vegetables can be quite useful. Bread, rice, grains, potatoes and pastas, all those starchy carbohydrates, generally they'll have a low greenhouse gas footprint. The more processed, the more likely it's going to need more water and more energy to produce it. So trying to go for more whole grain fruits and vegetables as much as possible. Maize and wheat are particularly unprocessed, are particularly low greenhouse gas. Potatoes and root vegetables, whereas rice is produced in the paddy fields and they do require a lot of water. Rice is the 3rd largest crop after sugarcane and maize, and more than 50% of the people in the world rely on it, but it produces 10% of global methane emissions, and stunningly requires 34 to 43% of the world's irrigation water. So rice is not a good food to try and encourage people to eat. But interestingly, there's a lot of research going into sustainable farm practices to try and improve it for better management, so the footprint is a lot smaller. So in the UK, it's trying to source local grains and go for things like potatoes, quinoa, wheat, oats and other grains that are grown in the UK. So the hot topics that often come up when people have inquiries about vegan diets, I thought I'd just touch on those. Protein continues to be a hot topic, so I'm going to cover that. Also, omega-3 fatty acids is one that does come up time and time again. Iron, vitamin B12, calcium, vitamin D and iodine. So I'm going to look and see how those are important from a health point of view and also look at the link with sustainability. Protein for vegans is not an issue. We can get all the essential amino acids, which are the building blocks of protein, from plants. We do not need to eat animal products for proteins. Again, people think these essential fatty acids, essential proteins need to come from animals. They do not at all. So the kinds of foods that you'll get your essential amino acids from will be met if you have a varied mixed diet. So omnivores overconsume protein, particularly red and processed meat anyway. And as I said, Public Health England have now prioritised plant-based proteins over animal-based proteins because they know overeating protein is not good for our health and certainly can be damaging with regard to if you have particularly a lot of red and processed meats. So if you have a varied vegan diet and you're consuming adequate calories, you will meet all your protein requirements. You do not need to think about having, people used to talk about having plant proteins combined at each meal. There's no need to do that. As long as you're having a variety throughout the day, you'll meet your requirements. So having a variety of cereals, nuts, seeds and vegetables, you'll meet all your nutritional requirements. At the moment, protein intake is way above what people should be eating. So from a sustainability point of view, if meat eaters choose to a plant-based diet, they'd reduce their protein intake and it would have a benefit for the health and for the environment. So as I said, if you're having a varied diet throughout the day, you'll meet all your essential amino acid needs. So the varied foods are having things from the different food groups. So your cereals, from your nuts and seeds, your beans and pulses, and just have a mix throughout the day. I just want to mention about nuts here actually, because people ask me about how sustainable nuts are. And with all the research and with the work we did with the One Blue Dot document, it was interesting to show which nuts are more sustainable than others. So with regard to Brazil nuts are a good source of many nutrients, but because the trees grow wild and they can't be cultivated, they require the diversity of the rainforest. They're one of the most sustainable nuts to have actually, so Brazil nuts are very good. The ones that need a lot of water, interestingly, are walnuts, almonds, pistachios and cashews. So they need a lot of water. Whereas hazelnuts, I'm not sure if there are many hazelnut trees now in the UK, but hazelnuts need very little water and their crop is very high, so they yield a lot. So the most sustainable sources of nuts are hazelnuts, pecans, pine nuts and Brazils. So they're the ones to try and go for more if you can. The other concern as a protein source is soya. And we know the two major producing countries are the US and Brazil. And soya is Brazil's biggest export. And there's been lots of concerns about the extent of deforestation to produce the soya. And that often means vegans are very concerned because we as vegans often consume a lot of soya, but only 6% of that soya we consume comes from those forests. The rest is fed to animals. So eating soya as a vegan is still better for the environment than eating the animals. So if people ate less animals, they wouldn't need to grow so much soya. So it's trying to reassure people that soya has lots of health benefits, and from a vegan point of view, it's a sustainable source. It's the animals that are not a sustainable source. The next thing I want to talk about is essential fats. Again, there's so much in the press, and still, unfortunately, the British Dietetic Association advocate having these long-chain omega-3 fatty acids from fish. I've yet to see convincing evidence that we need to have fish for this essential fatty acid, because our body can make it. But because there's so much in the media about this long-chain omega-3 fatty acid, which comes from fish, particularly oily fish, there is concerns whether vegans are getting enough. And studies have shown that levels are lower in vegans, but the significance of this is just not known. As I said, when I became vegan in the 70s, there's a Professor Sandra who still writes a lot on vegan nutrition, and he did research looking at children and the long-chain omega-3 fatty acids. Lower levels were found in them, but as I said, no detrimental effects had been noted at all. We know this fatty acid is important for our health, but again, how do we compare ourselves with omnivores? Can we really compare ourselves? Nevertheless, it's really important that you maximise your intake of the short-chain omega-3s that make these long-chain omega-3 fatty acids. So, as I said, essential nutrients all come from plants. The reason why it's in fish is because fish eat plants. They eat plankton, they eat algae, so that's how we get that long-chain fatty acid if we eat fish. So as long as you're having a good balanced diet and thoughtful about what you eat, you should get the right balance of the omega-3 fatty acids. However, if you want to consider a supplement, there are these algae supplements you can get. They're very expensive. As I said, there's no evidence to suggest we need to take these. But if you want to, it is a sustainable food, because these algae supplements can be grown in a variety of different habitats, and they can even be grown in wastewater. So having those supplements isn't going to have an impact on the environment. However, if you have a balanced diet, and if you optimise your intake of the short-chain omega-3 fatty acids that make the long-chain omega-3s, then you should have significant in your body. So the omega-3 fatty acids come from things like your linseeds, your rapeseed, hemp seeds, walnuts, and your dark green leafy vegetables. And then it's thinking about limiting your intake of the short-chain omega-6 fatty acids that can compete with those omega-3 to make the omega-3 long chain. So they tend to be in lots of our processed vegan foods. So just be aware of that. But again, it's about balance. Iron, I think, is one that does still come up, and I still get some patients referred to me by a well-meaning GP worried because they're vegan or vegetarian, are they going to get adequate iron? We know that red meat is the best source of bioavailable iron, but that doesn't mean it's essential or important. And the British Dietetic Association acknowledges that we can get adequate from plant foods. And again, choosing more sustainable plant foods over animal foods means you can still meet your iron requirements. And as part of the One Blue Dot document, there's quite a big section on iron, because some dietitians may be anxious about that, so used to giving advice about red meat for iron. And we know certain foods enhance absorption, and we know if people have low levels taking in less iron than they need, the body can utilise that and the absorption can improve, and we can adapt to inefficient iron absorption. And we know vitamin C boosts iron intake. So again, iron intake can easily be met. As you can see there, the requirements can easily be met well above with something very simple like your cereals with a milk, jacket potato with baked beans, and then you have a handful of nuts and dried fruit, very easily meet your iron requirement. And if you add a glass of orange juice to that, or have a piece of fruit, you can very quickly boost that iron intake. Yeah, the examples there I've put at the bottom. Yes, grains and seeds, legumes, dried fruit, molasses. lots of foods rich in iron. The other nutrient that is of concern is vitamin B12. This is the only supplement I'd say that vegans need to really make sure they have a reliable source of vitamin B12. There's no known toxicity levels, so having plenty of B12 is important. So all B12 is made by bacteria, and that includes bacteria living in our gut. And it's way down in our digestive tract, and it's far too low down for us to be able to utilise and use. We absorb B12 in our small intestine, and the bacteria producing it live in our large intestine. So as we don't eat animal products that contain this vitamin, vegans need to take a B12 supplement or need to make sure they have adequate fortified foods. So again, it can be met thoughtfully through your diet, but I think to reassure yourself, I'd say take a supplement. And there's lots of different supplements available, finding one that you're happy with, but it is important that you have adequate vitamin B12. I'm now going to talk about dairy and how that's the second largest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions after our red and processed meat. Dairy is seen as the main source of calcium, and people still think of that these days. And when I did my degree in dietetics, quite a few years ago now, I didn't realise a lot of the nutrition information that was produced was funded and produced by the dairy industry. And the dairy industry produced lots of the nutrition information for all different health professionals. So obviously it's going to be biased. And they still do produce information sheets on calcium. And I still come across dietitians that still think calcium is the most important source for, dairy is the most important source for calcium. Years ago, as hunter-gatherers, we'd eat lots of green leafy vegetables, which is a very good source of calcium. We just don't need to eat enough green leafy vegetables these days. Interestingly, as you can see here, the contribution of dairy products to greenhouse gas emissions is huge, whereas soya is way down the list. What's important is that we can get adequate calcium from a plant-based diet, which I'll show you in the next slide, but the fortified dairy milks, non-dairy milks, can be useful to just boost your calcium intake. And what's useful now, I think, there's so many cheese alternatives to dairy, and that really helps with people moving away from the animal products, because cheese is responsible for almost 40% of greenhouse gas emissions, and it's one of the biggest contributors, as you can see from this slide. So cheese is still huge with regard to the effect on our environment. So if you eat a varied diet, you're going to meet your calcium requirements. And as I said, it's quite useful having these fortified dairy milks that can boost your intake, but you do not need to have supplements of calcium unless you're not meeting your requirements. Again, there's been lots of studies looking at bone status of vegans and vegetarians. And certainly if vegans are meeting their calcium intake, their bone status is absolutely fine. If meat eaters aren't meeting their calcium intake, they're going to have bone problems, and so are vegans. So again, it's making sure you have a good variety in your diet. And the recommendations for adults is 700 milligrams per day. And as you can see, that could easily be met, described here on the slide. The next thing I'm going to talk about is vitamin D. And again, people often think that milk contains vitamin D. It doesn't. The only reason dairy milk might contain vitamin D is if it's fortified, if it's added. So vitamin D is quite hard to meet for the majority of people, but the main source is sunlight. So people should be getting a daily intake by getting out in the fresh air and getting some sunlight. Omnivores get it from fish and eggs that have been fed vitamin D. So to boost your vitamin D levels, make sure you go out for short periods in the sun, in the daylight, to try and boost your levels. Obviously don't get burnt. And the best times is between 11 and 3 to expose yourself to the sunlight. But the main sources of vitamin D for vegans are your plant-based spreads, also your fortified foods, mushrooms that have been treated with UV rays. The plant-based spreads can be a problem for vegans from the sustainability point of view, because nearly all of them are with palm oil. So this is a concern for many vegans if you're having a spread. And we know the palm oil industry is destroying a significant amount of tropical rainforests. But again, we know that going from plant-based eating to from dairy eating is still going to be much better for the environment, but try to look for sustainable palm oil sources or to go for the spreads that don't have palm oil in, which is quite difficult actually. I've only found 2 plant-based spreads that don't have palm oil in. I don't know if anybody's found any more than that, but they're very limited. A patient said to me a little while ago, actually, why do you want to put grease on anything or in anything, just use oil, which is a really good point actually. So I'm just going to touch on iodine, which is another hot topic that people are concerned about. And we know that iodine can be a problem for the general population, particularly in women and children, and the suggestions are they getting enough iodine? Non-vegans get it from consuming dairy products or from eating fish. It's very difficult to know how much iodine is in plant foods. We really don't know. And with the low quality soils there are these days, then they're going to be more deficient. So by trying to buy more organic foods, that will help improve soil quality, and hopefully that would start to increase our iodine levels. For vegans, the main source would be seaweed, but to be careful with some of the supplements such as kelp, which you could give yourself too much iodine. So it's trying to get the balance right of iodine. So for some people it might be best just to consider a supplement, but if you're getting a good mixed diet, you should meet your iodine requirements. But if you are concerned, then getting a supplement with the right amount may be beneficial. If people use salt, although we try to encourage people to reduce their salt intake, then it's worth going to an iodized source of salt. But generally, nori would be the best seaweed to have. So 1 to 1.5 sheets of nori a day is absolutely fine, but not to overdo your iodine. The other thing that the one blue dot looks at is the impact of sugary drinks and foods on the environment. And we know that the sweetened drinks are one of the biggest UK dietary greenhouse gas emissions, the sugary Coca-Colas, fizzy drinks, those kind of foods. And they do occupy a lot of land to produce them. So I find with vegans and vegetarians, they don't tend to have those kind of drinks as much as the general population, which is great. But what we need to think about is bottled water. People are drinking a lot of bottled water, and that has a heavy footprint as well. So try to replace the sugary drinks or bottled water with tap water. And we do know that bottled water takes over 1,000 years to biodegrade, and about 80% of the single-use bottles go to littered uses, which is really concerning. 70% of all our food waste comes from the home, which is absolutely incredible. But again, I like to think as vegans, we don't waste food as much. The top of the food waste, though, interestingly, is fruit and veg. So again, it's trying to be mindful about what you buy and how much you waste. So again, the One Blue document focuses on how you can utilise leftover foods and trying to improve and reduce that footprint from all the waste. So because there's so many vegan ready foods available now, I think it's more likely that vegans can contribute to that. So again, it's being mindful about what you buy and try not to waste those foods. So as I said, 70% of all food waste comes from the home, and about 25% of all food we purchase is wasted, so a quarter of all food. But again, I'd like to look at that with vegans. I tend to think that we wouldn't waste that kind of food. But there's a lot of emphasis in the One Blue document about that. So as you can see there, the tonnes from fruits and vegetables, 1.2 million tonnes, versus meat and fish, which is a lot less. So if we're encouraging people to eat more fruits and vegetables, we're worried about them wasting, aren't we, and going into food waste. So the last bit I'm going to talk about very briefly is about carbohydrates and type 2 diabetes. Over 90% of people with type 2 diabetes are overweight or obese. We know there's been a lot in the media lately about following low-carb diets and the benefits of following low-carb diets for people with type 2 diabetes. And interestingly, carbohydrates is one of the macronutrients with no established minimum requirements. We say how much minimum of fat people should have, how much minimum of protein people have, but we don't with carbohydrates. And we know some populations have thrived with a lot of carbohydrate being their main source of energy, and other populations have survived without much carbohydrate. So it's understandable that people are confused. Is carbohydrate essential or not? So when people cut down on their carbohydrate, they often have health benefits. But when you look at it in more detail, you look at the quality of the carbohydrate they've cut down on, and that's the issue, is the qualities of carbohydrates. So we know specific groups, such as people with type 2 diabetes, who are more insulin resistant, and that means their body can't uptake and use insulin properly. They can benefit from reduced carbohydrate diets. But when you pick it and look at it in a bit more detail, it's the quality of that carbohydrate they've eaten. So they cut down on their white bread, their crisps, their pies and pastries, cakes and biscuits. They're going to get health benefits. Most people do eat too much, but if they then swapped those carbohydrates for whole grains, beans and pulses, they're going to have a lot of health benefits. And again, studies have shown that people eating the right types of carbohydrates have health benefits, and they don't need to cut carbohydrates out of their diet. However, one size doesn't fit all, so that diet must match that person's requirements and what they need. But I want to emphasize that there's lots of health benefits from changing to the right types of carbohydrates. I could talk for ages about diabetes, but I know somebody else is going to cover it later on, and I'm running out of time anyway. So the core messages are that to eat a sustainable vegan diet is making sure you have balance and have a variety of foods. Value your food, think about where it comes from, take time with producing it, and try not to waste foods. Go for seasonal and locally produced fruits and vegetables as much as possible. And don't be afraid of tinned and frozen. They can often be more nutritious than the fresh, because the fresh may have been hanging about in the shops for a long time. Also, maximise your omega-3s. We want to make sure you've got that right balance and you have adequate omega-6 fatty acids. Vitamin D and iodine. Again, with a balanced diet, you should be able to get those nutrients. But vitamin B12 is one to say, make sure you do take a supplement if you're not getting adequate fortified foods. And drink more tap water if you can, and avoid those soft sugary drinks. And I just want to finish with saying, when I became vegan, I had lots of people, friends and family, well-meaning, say, you're going to die, you can't be a vegan. And that's why I studied nutrition. And when I said that to a friend recently, my friend said, well, you're alive and kicking, you're full of beans, and I'm not talking kidney beans. And that really made me laugh. So thank you very much.